Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. Joining us now, Rehan Salam is executive editor of the National Review. Ed O'Keefe is with the Washington Post. CBS News congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes covers the Democrats for the network. And Ezra Klein is the founder of Vox.com. Nancy, you've been covering out there Senator Sanders. What do you make of him now after New York? Conversation I had with him. Do you see a tonal shift in his campaign?
Not enough of a tonal shift for the Clinton camp's liking, but a bit. He isn't saying she lacks judgment anymore, at least not this week. He isn't saying that she doesn't know what she's doing or that she's not qualified, which really rankled them. But they still don't like the fact that he's creating a contrast, let's say, on Wall Street, saying she needs to hand over her Wall Street speeches. What could possibly be in them? They feel that is still giving ammunition to the Trump camp. On the other hand, he is still a candidate. He needs to be able to draw contrast between himself and his only other opponent, which is Hillary Clinton.
Ezra, can you give me a sense? What's your sense of how negative Bernie Sanders has been? I mean, there is a lot of territory he could cover that he has not.
I do not think this has been a negative campaign at all. My colleague Matt Iglesias at Vox, he dug up an amazing clip from 1992 where Jerry Brown and Bill Clinton went at it. And Jerry Brown was attacking Hillary Clinton's legal fees and over corruption. And when you go and watch what this looked like in past debates, this has been the gentlest, most respectful, most substantive also campaign we've seen in a long time, in a way that does credit to them both. They have real differences. They've explained them quite clearly, and they've generally kept it above the board, which is one reason I'm skeptical of those who say it's going to be all that hard for the party to unite after the convention.
I thought it was interesting, John, that he's conceded to you that he's not interested in using his tens of millions of dollars to start a new political action group or to, endorse like-minded Democratic candidates, but that he wants to become a member of the party and focus on policy. Minimum wage, affordable health care.
Well, there's something very striking about that. The fact that he has not been a Democrat for decades. And the movement that he's built really is something separate and distinct from the Democratic Party. So when he says that, what he's saying is that the Democratic Party is kind of a weak host that's waiting to be taken over by this new movement. The trouble, however, is look at the fact that Bernie Sanders actually has a lot of very wealthy supporters. That's kind of interesting. He's calling for higher taxes on the rich and what have you. What people are missing is that Bernie Sanders is speaking to a lot of white voters in many cases who feel marginalized by the rising place of identity politics in the party, the rising place of African Americans and Latinos. They don't necessarily think of it that way, but Bernie Sanders is giving them a way to say that, hey, we still have a place at the table.
I'm very skeptical of that interpretation of Sanders. I think that when you look at what's happening with Sanders and the party right now, you see fundamentally a generational split. Above everything else you see is a tremendous generational split, winning 80% of young voters in New Hampshire. That's one reason I think that Hillary Clinton might win this election, even as Bernie Sanders ends up being the future of the Democratic Party. You can't be Hillary Clinton again unless you're Hillary Clinton. She has such deep connections to the party's institutional dimensions, such a tremendous history with its various constituent actors. But if you're a young, ambitious Democratic politician asking what model that appears successful that you can replicate, Bernie Sanders, who, as you say, was not part of the party for a long time, has done this entirely on message. That, I think, is won the rising class of young voters in the Democratic Party.
The trouble
that,
is,
I think, is going to have a tremendous effect on the next class of Democratic politicians. The trouble is that if you look at African American voters,
for example, here's a constituency that is liberal, but not monolithically liberal. You have a large number of conservative and moderate voters who do not vote Republican, right? So that's part of the reason why Hillary Clinton has fared well with these voters. When you look at younger voters, it is true that Bernie Sanders has done well with young voters of color, and yet when we look at that constituency, those folks have not been voting in large numbers. When we see other voters of color coming into the process later on, my guess is that they will be more inclined to support someone like Hillary Clinton, who is talking about the particular challenges facing voters of color. So this is going to be very interesting. This is something that is distinct to Democratic politics as it's evolved over recent decades.
Don't you think that the candidate who says we don't have to make these big compromises, we can go for broke, is always going to appeal to young voters who are idealistic, where someone like Hillary Clinton, who has been around the bend, who has had to make some of these unpleasant compromises that basically every politician has to make to get things done, it is not going to be as inspirational to someone who is observing politics for the first time.
Ed, do you think there's any danger, these younger voters who have turned out in such numbers for Bernie Sanders, who are excited by him in a way that they're not for Hillary Clinton, that if she were to get the nomination, that she's in danger of really losing those voters? I mean, if Donald Trump is the alternative, aren't they coming to her?
That's the gamble that they're hoping for, but I think they're very conscious and concerned about it. I think that's part of why there's a real hope and concern that she maybe shows off a little more of her personality and focuses on the history of what would be the first woman presidency. Also, a lot of sensitivity to who the running mate would be. Is it somebody who is as liberal or similarly liberal to Bernie Sanders, or someone who's a little younger and might draw out those younger voters?
And it all depends on Bernie Sanders himself and what he does. If he has a reckoning with Hillary Clinton and gets behind her and says, this is the candidate, we have to beat Donald Trump. He has said that he will do whatever he can to defeat Donald Trump. He hasn't said, I'll do whatever I can to back Hillary Clinton. If he says to his millions of supporters, look, she's talking the talk, she's walking the walk that I want her to, you need to vote for her, that will make a huge difference.
In 1980, Ezra, Ted Kennedy, who fought Jimmy Carter, said, I want the following things on the platform. And he got a lot of those. Is there a to-do list or a specific list that Sanders might want, where he could use this leverage he has with all these voters who love him to say, I would like Hillary Clinton to adopt the following positions, not just speak in broad terms, but be quite specific?
I think platforms used to offer a vehicle for that kind of trade that people don't feel as potency anymore. I think that even if Sanders did get Hillary Clinton to, say, endorse a carbon tax, the fact of the matter is she would then get into office, she'd be probably facing a Republican House, assuming she won the presidency, and she wouldn't necessarily do it anyway. So I'm not sure that somebody like Sanders, with as much mistrust in the system as he has, would see that as a way to go. What I do think is going to be the interesting question with him is whether, if he does not win the nomination, he converts his fundraising, he converts his movement into a down ballot movement. How much is he really interested in leading a revolution that changes the Democratic Party and more broadly the country? And how much was the Bernie Sanders revolution just an effort to get Bernie Sanders elected to the presidency?
And what you're talking about is a multi-year, multi-process. I mean, it would start in this election, but presumably
right. I mean, does he want to change the party so in the future candidates like Bernie Sanders are the candidates of the establishment, or was this really just about his particular campaign? And if his campaign doesn't succeed, then he walks away from it.
And there are about 24 Bernie-crats, as they call themselves, running for Congress in different districts across the country. Most of them are going to come up short, but that would be a very effective way for him to sort of turn his money and his mechanism.
It's important to keep in mind, however, that as you move the party in one direction, as you grow it in one way, you of course risk losing some of the people who've been supporting the party all along. Now, right now, given that this looks as though it might be a Trump-Clinton race, all of the relevant hemorrhaging is likely to be happening on the Republican side. But again, we're talking about what is likely to be a decade-long process in which Bernie Sanders and his acolytes are hoping to remake the party. And that will be very interesting, looking at what that realignment winds up looking like, because the Republican Party post-Trump is going to, of course, have to adapt to those changes and adapt to who is actually sloughing off of the Democratic coalition.
Still
I
adapting
think
to the
it's
Tea
going
Party
to depend partly on how he feels that he's being treated by the party at the convention and going forward. Because I've asked him before, point blank, so are you going to use your prodigious abilities to raise money on behalf of this party that you now belong to? And he said, stay tuned. He hasn't quite decided what he's going to do.
Last words.
An underutilized talent of the Clintons, or an undernoticed talent, is how good they are turning former enemies into allies. She was good at this with Republicans in 2000 in the Senate. Richard Milton Scaife ended up funding many Clinton global initiatives. They are very good at treating former opponents well.
David Brock.
All right.
David Brock.
She may already be in that process now. We heard her this week sort of welcoming the Sanders people, or trying to welcome them into the fold. Let's pause here. We'll be right back with more from our panel, and we'll talk about that other party. And we're back with our panel. Rehan, I want to start with you. Something Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign manager, said to a group of Republicans meeting. He said, quote, "You'll start to see more depth of the person, the real person. You'll see a different guy," saying that Donald Trump is going to evolve. What do you make of that?
There was one indication of this when we saw Donald Trump's speech at AIPAC. He gave a speech that he had read from a teleprompter. He was very disciplined. He said basically all the usual things one would expect a Republican candidate to say. The trouble is that Donald Trump has done as well as he has because of his attitude, because of his ability to create excitement and energy. And I find it very hard to believe that he's going to be able to maintain that disciplined tone, because it's not really about policy issues. He's taken a dozen different policy stances over the course of his campaign so far. So I just find it very unlikely that Manafort is going to be able to discipline him in this way.
And does it work, Ezra? John Kasich said in sort of an interesting moment there, talking about a rival, he said, well, my negatives were really high. It takes a long time for them to go down. Usually politicians never want to admit their negatives are high. Donald Trump's are very high. Can he do anything? Could any politician do anything to drive down those negatives?
Well, there's always something you can do if you could become a very different person. The problem is it turns out to be extremely hard to become a very different person on the fly in the middle of a campaign when you're tired all the time, when you're always in front of the cameras, when the media already has ideas and narratives about you that somewhat structure what they do and don't report. I always think it's actually quite funny, the idea that Trump is going to unveil a moderate part of himself. I remember him coming out and saying, if I'm elected president, I'll become the most politically correct guy you can imagine. A person who could make that kind of makeover of himself is not the person who comes out and says that aloud. He does not have the discipline to not say everything he's thinking, and as such, as Reihan says, attitudinally, he will not be able to offer the sobriety that I think codes for people as moderate, which is separate from policy positions that are moderate.
And what's fascinating, if you talk to people who are voting for Trump or who want him to win, it's either, I like that he says whatever he wants, that he's off the cuff, that he's totally impolitic, or they say, well, he may be saying those things, but he's not going to actually be that way when he's president. So even if he tries to change it, it may keep his base of support, but there's no reason to believe he's going to be able to grow his base of support if he makes those changes, because everyone else will say, well, we've seen what's been going on for the last 9 months.
I mean, here's the guy who says, I can be really presidential, just wait, and then turns around and says, well, if I were being presidential, none of you would be here. You'd all be so bored by me.
Right.
Yeah, that was very telling.
But isn't this, though, Rayon, what some people who have tried to warm to Trump have kind of hoped for, that he would be malleable? There was one quote from somebody on the Hill basically saying, the Republican leadership will tell him kind of what to do on a policy front, and he'll come in right behind that because he's a movable fellow. So isn't that what Manafort is essentially saying, is he said, we'll get to wherever you need us to get?
There have been a variety of interpretations and a variety of moments when people have thought that. So there's a time, several months ago after South Carolina when you had Bob Dole and other, grandees of the party saying that, gosh, he actually might be a lot more sensible than someone like, say, Ted Cruz. He might be more malleable in these ways you described. And then that goes away. And then people, go silent. The people were saying that he could become more sensible in these ways. My sense is that he is going to try to build a brand. He's going to try to build excitement around the campaign. But beyond that, he is a rogue agent. And he also, by the way, how's he going to raise money? He's been promising that he's a self-funder this entire time. And the Democrats are going to have tremendous resources at their disposal. He has already alienated large numbers of major donors. There's a huge apparatus, not just the party, but around the party, that is not going to coalesce around him this time. So he is going to feel a need for that free media. And how is he going to get it?
That's right. And Nancy, his argument, he's going to have to find somebody to fund this general election because it's super expensive. But one of his big arguments is, I'm self-funded, I'm not bought and paid for. How's he going to fix that?
Well, he can put some more of his own money into it, and he is worth between $4 billion or $10 billion or however much he says he's worth that day.
Oh, he says 10. That's for sure. It's just other people may not.
Today it's 10. But he is going to have a huge problem, as Reihan said, raising money. The Koch brothers just today saying, they might even get behind Hillary Clinton before they get behind Donald Trump. And there's even a question of whether a lot of these big sponsors who you typically see at the convention will be there, or whether they will pull out because they don't want to be associated with the Donald Trump brand.
Where, Ezra, do you think the ultimate Trump convention argument is, which is about fairness? He basically says, I have the votes, I have the delegates. Whether I get the majority of delegates by this date doesn't matter. The fair thing to do would be to give me the nomination. How do you think he's doing in making that case?
I think it is going to be very hard to know how that's going to feel until we're right up at the convention. I've been talking to some of the other campaigns about this, and they're very confident, and they'll make the argument that, look, the only rule here is you need a majority of the delegates, and if not, it's anybody's game. And I think that this is a place where your rules conflict with your norms. What people are used to doing, what is going to feel normal to them, is to give it to the guy in the lead. To give it to someone else is going to feel at that moment, after that first ballot vote, like a tremendous, tremendous move. And I don't know how they're going to build the permission structure for those delegates to give it to Ted Cruz or to some outsider. So I think Donald Trump has a pretty easy argument here. The question is if he does something so offensive to those delegates that he's not ultimately able to make it.
And he'd better do it, because we don't have to think about this. We know, based on results yesterday, that these seats are continuing to get packed with supporters of Ted Cruz. It happened in Utah, Kentucky, Maine, Minnesota, and South Carolina again, where you will vote on the first ballot for Trump if he won your state, but if there's a second ballot, they can switch very quickly and vote for Cruz. And that may not get him to 1237 on that second ballot, but it starts to make it nearly impossible for Trump to prevail.
This is the inside game
Right.
that Cruz has been winning that Donald Trump is so irritated about.
But it's looking less and less likely that this will even be something that plays out, because if you look at our battleground tracker, Trump is winning in Pennsylvania. He's leading in Indiana, which was looking like a state where the candidates could kind of blunt his momentum. I mean, if he stays on this trajectory, he can win the 1237 outright, and you don't get to a convention fight.
Win a fear-based campaign against Donald Trump in the primaries. You can absolutely win a fear-based campaign against him in the general election, and that is the fundamental dilemma. If you look at Sarah Palin, for example, running mates never matter, right? Except in 2008, a running mate did matter. She initially had enormous popularity. She seemed refreshing and new, but then suddenly people were questioning her judgment. They were questioning the fact that she was a heartbeat away from the presidency, and that was the one time when a running mate mattered. This time around, it's simply a matter of his being erratic, his seeming unreliable, his willingness to change positions at any moment. That is just going to be such a slam dunk, and just somehow Ted Cruz can't make that case. John Kasich can't make that case in the primaries.
John Kasich's been trying to make that case. He met with some delegates. He wouldn't tell us how the meeting went.
That's right. And this was in Pennsylvania, because you've got 54 people who get elected on Tuesday as delegates and don't officially have to declare their allegiance. The Cruz and the Trump campaigns trying to get some elected that would vote for them. Kasich says he's done it and wouldn't name names. He continues to make that argument he made to you that I can beat Hillary Clinton in a general election. It doesn't seem to matter. I think we are seeing echoes of 1964, as you mentioned. And look, he'll stick around. He'll get his votes. He's there if someone needs a running mate, perhaps, or if they do need a late ballot option. But beyond that, I was stunned. He could be running another gubernatorial-style campaign this week in Pennsylvania, like he did up in New Hampshire to play second. He hasn't been doing it. He could be doing that in Indiana. He could have done it in Maryland. And over again, we just see him bouncing around to all these different states, making a few appearances instead of honing in on one or two places to actually get a win or pick up a big collection of delegates. He just hasn't done it.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's it. There's more from us, though, so stay with us. And we're back with New York Times White House correspondent Mark Landler. He's got a new book out, Alter Egos, and has written the cover story for the New York Times Magazine today, How Hillary Became a Hawk. So, Mark, let's start right there. What is Hillary Clinton's foreign policy worldview? Where does it fit in where Obama has been, where others have been?
Well, first of all, I'd say really the word to use would be she's a textbook American exceptionalist. This phrase American exceptionalism gets thrown around a lot. She's someone who fervently believes that the U.S. has a positive role to play, that U.S. engagement is vital, that the military and the threat of military force is vital at times to press our national interest, and that puts her at odds with President Obama in a significant way, not necessarily in the broadest strokes, but in some specific decisions having to do with intervention, Syria, Libya, places like that. You see her worldview as really being in some stark contrast to his, and that's the relationship that really fascinated me in this book.
It's a complicated world, and there are many places, so it's tricky to ask this, but I'll do it anyway. Is there one place, is it Syria or Libya, where you think those differences between the two of them, as people are evaluating her compared to the sitting president, where they differ? An example that's the best one.
I think the brightest line was probably in Syria, where, if you recall, she was in favor of supplying arms to the moderate rebels back in 2012, and President Obama was initially reluctant. He came around and finally agreed to do it, but never with much enthusiasm. And he's, held the line against intervention against Syria. During the campaign, Hillary Clinton has come out in favor of a no-fly zone. President Obama is still against that. So I think that's probably the one area where you've seen it play out over the longest time, where there just, I think, simply is a different view. I think Hillary Clinton believes that a stronger American intervention would give the U.S. some leverage to change events on the ground. I think President Obama is just fundamentally skeptical that we can make a difference in Syria. And so that's the one that I really drilled into as a major difference.
The term indispensable nation is associated with the Clintons. Is that what this is, that America is still the indispensable nation? Because the phrase that's gotten in the Obama years is that he talks about free riders, which is to say other nations are not doing their share. So is that indispensable?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And indispensable nation was a phrase that Bill Clinton made popular. And one of the things I do look into is to what extent Bill Clinton's experiences as president and his worldview filtered into what Hillary Clinton believes. And I think that's a very good example. I think with President Obama, on the other hand, I think what he is saying is, look, we need to define our interests a little bit more narrowly than perhaps we did in the heyday of the post-World War II period. We need to acknowledge that we can't be at the center of every single issue. So you look at Ukraine, for example. I think Hillary Clinton, there again, would probably be inclined to be more forward-leaning, maybe supplying defensive weapons to the Ukrainians, whereas the president is saying, look, they're not a vital national interest for us the way they are for the Russians. We need to be more cautious.
Where does this come from? Because people who cover Hillary Clinton as a candidate see her as being so cautious, and you write about her as constantly kind of monitoring her status in the role of places, but yet she is more forward-leaning, more aggressive in the use of military force. How do those two exist?
Well, it's interesting, and you raise an interesting paradox, because I think that on military force and on the use of the military and intervention, she is more risk-ready, more forward-leaning than the president. On diplomacy, interestingly enough, which is another major part of my book, she's actually much more cautious. I argue, and I think that you can make a persuasive case that had she been elected in 2008 instead of President Obama, we might never have done the nuclear deal with Iran. That was a very difficult, risky deal, and she was very skeptical about it. He threw himself into it. Likewise with Cuba, I think that one's a little more questionable. Perhaps she would have done Cuba, but again, the president took a major risk. So while he's cautious on the military side, he's actually a real risk taker on the diplomatic side.
It's really interesting. You quote an aide to Stan McChrystal, the former commander leading American troops in Iraq. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry.
Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan. Sorry.
And Iraq.
And Iraq.
Yeah.
But on the Afghanistan question, this aide said that Hillary Clinton led to the over-militarization of the debate. Is that what you're talking about there, where her view on military kind of overtakes the diplomacy?
Yeah, I think that was that though may have been a unique set of circumstances where it was early in the administration. She was trying to sort of prove her relevance and her bona fides, and so in that debate she really lined up so strongly behind Bob Gates, behind McChrystal, behind Petraeus, that I think she maybe lost an opportunity to make a stronger case for the diplomatic side of the equation. In Afghanistan, we needed to perhaps do more with Pakistan, perhaps have more of a greater recognition of the Karzai government. And that was really the role she could have played in that debate. I would argue she didn't as much as she could have.
Last 20 seconds. Where would you expect Hillary Clinton to turn first if she were president?
Well, I'd be very interested to see whether she finally did try to tackle Syria in a more aggressive way than the president. I'd also be very interested to see what she does with Vladimir Putin. She's sort of been much more skeptical for a longer period of time about the intentions of the Russians. I'd love to see what she did with him, not just in Syria, but in Ukraine.
All right, Mark Landler, thanks so much for this fascinating look. The
Thank
book
you, John.
is Alter Egos. Thanks for being with us, and we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.